So fight for your life and reject it. You better give me space, I'm protective.
Hello guys, welcome to my channel.
It is dawn in the valley of Kathmandu. A boy walks with his father to the fields. His name is Apulal Mahajan. Not that there's too much importance in a name. You could find a young person like Apulal in any poor country of the world, helping his father work his plot of land, while, if he's lucky, getting enough education to read and write. What is important is that this valley is his home, and its future is his future. Kathmandu is the capital of the Kingdom of Nepal. For centuries, the great trading city on the route that wound across the Himalayas from China and Tibet down into India. Remote and inaccessible, this kingdom has never been colonized. In fact, not until after the Second World War was Nepal open to the outside world, to reveal a culture, and particularly a style of architecture we found nowhere else. That culture is now in danger of disappearing forever, which is why in Paris at the UNESCO headquarters, the Nepalese government, with United Nations support, are making an eloquent plea for its protection and preservation.
Between the way of life of the people of Nepal and the monuments which
Nepal's Minister of Education, Pashupati Samser Rana.
The monuments in Nepal are not the fossilized remains of a dead culture. Every temple that you visit in Nepal, you will find there burning the incense of daily prayer. Every idol that you see will have on it the vermilion mark of devotion. It is this living reality. It is this culture which allows no barriers to exist between the places where there are the temples and the private houses, between the monuments and the way of the life of people, that gives, I think, a unique flavor to the nature of culture in Nepal. So that even the tourist can say with Kipling that the wildest dreams of Kew are the realities of Kathmandu.
The architecture of Nepal may be unique, but not its problems. As old shrines and houses decay, so the modern city of Kathmandu becomes like modern anywhere. New opportunities create new priorities, as economist Ashok Pandey explains.
Old buildings. I think an average Nepali in Kathmandu would rather see a skyscraper than see his old house being renovated and preserved. I think that would have a much greater aesthetic value to him. This whole new feeling of conservation now is more of an externally inspired renaissance, if I may put it that way.
Providing for the future and caring for the past and the old things of value. The government of Nepal would like to do both, but it needs and is asking for the help of other countries. The valley of Kathmandu, they say, is like the city of Venice, a place of threatened beauty that should be considered part of the world's cultural heritage. Whether that is justified and what its implications are, is what this story is about. was the Newar people, the original settlers of the valley, who created the artistic treasures of Kathmandu. What they created was mainly for their religion. For the Newar, like most people in Nepal, religion is not a once-a-week affair. It is fundamental to their daily lives. It is a tolerant blend of Hinduism and Buddhism, as anthropologist Corneille Geste explains.
In Hinduism spread very early and has been combined with Buddhism in such a way here in Kathmandu Valley that sometimes you don't understand what is Hindu, what is Buddhist, who is Shiva Magi, who is Buddha Magi.
The period of greatest creativity in the valley was during the Malla dynasty, a period that roughly coincided with Europe's Renaissance. A particular Malla king in the 15th century divided his kingdom among his children. The town of Patan was given to his daughter, while Bhaktapur went to his son Raya Malla, and Kathmandu itself to another son, Ratna Malla. It wasn't good for the kingdom's political stability, but architecturally the results were magnificent. Co-opting the skill of the Newar craftsmen, they competed by building ever finer temples and palaces. A traditional Newar dance. Under a strict caste system, the artistic life of the valley flourished in a way reminiscent of the craft guilds of medieval Europe. But if the Newar people were fine artists and successful traders, they were not good soldiers. In the 18th century, in the nearby city of Gorkha, there was a ruler called Prithvi Narayan Shah. With scant regard for the petty bickerings of his neighbors, he annexed the valley of Kathmandu and established what is now the Kingdom of Nepal. It was the Ranas who overthrew the Shah dynasty in the middle of the last century. They ran the country as their family fiefdom, keeping the ordinary Nepali well quarantined from the dangerous ideas then sweeping Europe. But they themselves travelled, sent their children to British schools, and imported to Nepal the Western neoclassical style of architecture. In 1951, the Shah monarchy reasserted its authority and Nepal changed from its policy of isolationism. Britain, partly because of the Gurkhas, had had a special relationship for many years. The present king, King Birendra, was sent to Eton. Today, he is the ruler of a country that has opened its doors to the modern world. The modern world has swept in. Yesterday, Kathmandu was a distant Shangri-La at the foothills of the Himalayas. It's now 1 hour's flight from Delhi. Trekkers, mountaineers, Indian traders, Tibetan refugees, tourists and students, in this old Newar town, they constantly come and go. The hippies of the 60s, for whom Kathmandu was a mecca, have gone already, at least most of them. In Freak Street these days, there's a sense that the party's over. They still play vintage Santana in the Yin and Yang Cafe, but yesterday's flower children are now into business, running. For the young Nepalis, the cultural influence is still more Indian than Western. There are no American films. But that is changing. Kathmandu's New Road Cowboys, as they are called, haven't seen Saturday Night Fever, but they play the visitor in the country's ancient culture rather than modern rip-off massage parlors. But there's the difficulty. The glory of that culture is its architecture, and that architecture is based on timber and delicate wood carving. It's not just the decay of the old buildings, but new buildings in the wrong place. Nowadays, there's government legislation to prevent this. It is legislation that is often ignored. Sometimes it is the private developers, able to pay the convenient backhander. Sometimes the government itself. It's a problem familiar to richer countries than Nepal. Then there's what the local CID refer to as the lifting of idols. The Kathmandu Valley is a treasure house of unguarded antiquities. 15 years ago, there was no stealing of precious artifacts. Now it's an everyday occurrence. The Newar craftsmen, masons, carpenters, wood carvers, ivory workers, goldsmiths have left a legacy beyond any international art dealer's wildest dreams. When Nepal was a close country, local people had no idea of their value. And if they had, they would not have dared take them. And this royal bath at Patan would not have had these crude gaps along its walls. But then the professionals moved in. Today in the local prison, some of the lifters of idols are serving time. But they're not the big operators. They are still at large. One group known as the Bombay Lama Gang work out of India. Although the police are shy to talk about them, they have their photos on file and their method of operation is well known. The thefts often involve the collusion of the local priests from the temples, while the smuggling out of the country involves local officials. Here in a back room at the National Museum is a mixture of objects either stored for safekeeping or retrieved by the police after being stolen. Like ivory smuggling in Kenya, the stealing continues because it involves important people, very important. Director of the Department of Archaeology, Ramesh Jangtapa, feels that the answer to this problem lies with those countries that provide the market, which means the sale rooms of London and Paris and New York. The alternative, as he sees it, would really be a very sad one.
You will see that the whole of valley is an open museum. You will see that sculptures are lying by the side of the river, by the side of the lanes and roads, by the side of the door, in the courtyard, in the open field, and is a very big question: how to preserve the tradition, how to preserve them where they are. Because it will be a bad day for us if we think to replace them, if we think to get them inside the so-called new museum walls, inside the walls of the museum. Let it remain as it is, as the manifestation of people's heritage. And perhaps, as you know, this is a unique scene you see here in the valley. And this environment, this happy relation between their God and the people, between their home and the God, between their monument and their house, this should be maintained.
In 1975, King Birendra, the present king, had his coronation. The ceremony took place in the old royal palace, a building known as the Hanuman Doka. Its partial restoration for the occasion marked Nepal's first large-scale attempt to tackle its conservation problems. The palace takes its name from Hanuman, the famous monkey god of Hindu mythology. His robe-covered statue stands sentinel outside the main entrance. As with so many great achievements, the restoration of this palace was largely due to the vision and single-minded, some say bloody-minded, determination of one man, John Sandy.
Benito, kina yo ali kalo छ?
दुई बेर बोल्ने
आउनु पर्छ र भित्र छ ओ थौ मेरो बिचार
ठिकै मरो आना पति
John Sandy is a British architect specializing in restoration work who came to Nepal in 1973 on a UNESCO contract.
यो किसिम
गमला
Before embarking on this undertaking, I'm afraid I have to admit I had to look up where Nepal was on the map. And I was a little apprehensive, as I'd never been further than the toe of Italy before. My first trip to Asia, totally alone, not speaking a word of Nepali. And when we eventually came out as a family, I was tackling perhaps the largest building in the valley. And it was very much of a make or break situation. One of the chief problems, of course, was that I had to build up my own workforce. When I arrived in Nepal, I was given Mr. Hariratna Ranjitkar, my counterpart, and a desk and a chair.
These two men made an extraordinary combination. With John Sandy's obsessive drive and Hariratna's know-how of local ways, they built up a team of craftsmen and workers that might well have been the envy of the Malla kings. Their experience was to provide the technical framework for the government and UNESCO when they later devised their master plan for the restoration of the Kathmandu Valley.
One of the limitations that I set myself was to avoid having to import any materials, because the importance of this particular job was to ensure that the Nepalese themselves could carry the work on after UNESCO and UNDP had drawn out. So therefore it was no point in bringing in sophisticated gadgets and techniques, but to employ what we could find in the market.
Many special skills developed during the Great Malla period had been neglected and forgotten. The old way of brickmaking, for example. The valley has a particularly good clay. In the past, this was used to make what was called the talia brick, a brick employed by the Mallas in their more sophisticated buildings. Each brick is made by hand. After very careful preparation, the clay is put in a mold. It is then left to dry for 2 or 3 days in the sun. Then comes the stage of actually cutting the brick. The brickmaker selects the best face and trims it to produce its characteristic sharp edge. It is then glazed with a special yellow clay, burnished with a hematite stone to give it a sheen, and finally fired in a kiln for a week.
One of the particular features of the brick is that it is slip glazed. It has very fine edges, or arises as they're known as. And a feature that you don't see normally when you're looking at the walls is that the brick is tapered or wedge-shaped, with the outer face being deeper than the inner face, which enables the bricklayers to lay a very tight joint with the mortar at the back of the brick.
The traditional method of roofing in the Kathmandu Valley is with the chingoti, a small interlocking tile that is bedded on mud. In Malla times, this mud was boiled to sterilize it. Otherwise, with a combination of monsoon, seed and pigeon droppings, they found themselves with an unwanted roof garden that eventually rotted the timbers. This was one occasion when John Sandy didn't use traditional methods. The mud was treated with a herbicide and the tiles with a silicone preparation to make them water resistant. If there is one thing that Newar craftsmen excelled at, it was wood carving. When John Sandy started on the Hanumandoka, many of the wood carvers had long ago gone back to farming because there was no work for them. Some of them, like Tulsi Kumar, are as skillful as any of the great carvers of the past.
One of the more intriguing aspects of the wood carving craft is the making of these grills, or akejals as they're known as. They are made of a series of interlocking pieces, and therefore there is no nailing or gluing used to hold it together. You have two basic shapes, the male and the female, and then the locking piece. These two unite and are pushed into position and then held with the key. And the great advantage in making them up out of separate pieces of timber is that they have great flexibility, and also they don't warp and twist.
The finest of Newar carvings are the tunesi, the large struts that support the traditional overhanging roofs. They consist usually of Hindu deities, sometimes with their consorts, and below figures in more worldly postures. Why these erotic and often humorous scenes should adorn the temples, no one quite knows, although there's no shortage of contradictory theories. In earlier times, the tunesi were not usually painted, but later, partly to conceal the decay and to protect them, they were covered with layer upon layer of bright colors. John Sandy, being of the more purist school of restoration, decided that at the Hanumandoka at least they should be restored to their original unpainted condition.
I was very fortunate in being able to select a very fine group of girls from Patan who were game for anything. Some of these larger windows, even right at the very top of the tower, were cleaned in situ off the scaffolding.
It was a lengthy process. First scraping out all the old paint and dirt, then brushing the carvings down with a solution of ammonia, repeating the process until all traces of paintwork were removed, and finally washing. One of the most delightful features of the old Hanumandoka were the bells. They hung beneath the eaves of the towers, catching the evening breeze. These bells, whose gentle sound represents an offering of prayer to the gods, have always been individually made by the lost wax process, which means they're initially modeled in wax, then coated in clay and cow dung, dried and covered a second time with a thicker clay. When this too is dry, the wax is melted out of the casing, leaving the empty bell-shaped interior. Into this they pour the molten brass. When John Sandy took on the restoration of Hanumandoka, all the bells had disappeared, so they made over 1,000 new ones. The Lalitpur Tower was damaged in the earthquake of 1934. It leaned at a rather unsafe angle of 15 degrees off plumb. The straightening of the tower was not the most difficult task confronting John Sandy's team, but it certainly provided one of the most dramatic contrasts. A more subtle problem that faces any architect involved in restoration is the question of the aesthetic guidelines he should follow. Nowadays in Europe, nearly anything that is old is considered of value. In Asia, that attitude can't be assumed. For instance, adding to a brick and timber building a cement penthouse is considered a most prestigious thing to do. And covering dilapidated brickwork with white stucco has a practical reason, even if it isn't traditional. Similarly, with new strip lighting instead of oil lamps in the temples, a touch of modernity of which the pujari or priest is no doubt very proud. And then there's the painting of carvings and statues, sometimes garish, sometimes more subtle. In Buddhism, the merit of painting is in the doing. The aesthetic quality of the end product is secondary. Often, too, colors are used to help the non-initiated distinguish between the different gods.
Colors are a very important aspect of our religion. They evoke certain emotional responses. Like, for example, in the Bhairav statue in Hanumandoka. Now, the whole idea of Bhairav being a god of wrath is supposed to inspire or rather transmit certain ideas to the beholder. I wouldn't expect you to be inspired by looking at Bhairab, but an average Nepali who identifies with this type of cult will be inspired by looking at him.
Most people are not too concerned with these issues. There is a more fundamental question. Nepal is still poor. Whether the Hanumandoka, only partially renovated, is completed depends on money and the support of other countries. Nepal's oft-quoted per capita income is only £75 a year. In a mainly subsistence economy, this doesn't mean much. Certainly here you will not see, not yet at least, the desperate poverty of Calcutta, for instance. But there is the question of priorities. How do you square the renovation of old buildings with the need for roads and schools and health clinics? At UNESCO headquarters, Nepal's Minister of Education, Pashupati Shamsher Rana.
If modernization for Nepal was merely a matter of changing the physical realities, and it was a soulless activity, let us say, then there would be a danger that modernization would in effect just be westernization. And one thing I think that Nepal does not want to do is to end up in the same way as the metropolitan West, with the problems of anomie, of alienation, and all these other problems.
Do you remember the little boy we saw at the beginning of the film with his father? Well, in his family there is certainly no sense of anomie or alienation. Apanal's father has 4 brothers, and they all live under the same roof. They are Hindu farming caste people, poor but not impoverished.